Welcome to our webinar today on how to leverage your leaders in your nonprofit email campaigns. Very exciting topic for us here at Cyberimpact, as well as with my friend Daniel over here. Something we're both quite passionate about and do believe in quite strongly. So
yes.
Very excited to have you all here. I will get Daniel to do a quick intro to himself before we jump into the content. So Daniel, take it away.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Francavilla. I am the founder of the Good Growth Company. And I've been working in marketing and in the agency space for some time, while also having run a nonprofit organization. So I have a little bit of a background in both marketing side and the social purpose side. So for today's webinar, obviously we're going to talk about how all things apply ultimately to email. But a lot of the work that I do is focused on thought leadership and personal branding and really helping the leaders to stand out. So we'll dive into that. We got quite a few tips, some case studies and some examples that we will walk through. There'll also be an opportunity for you to share. So don't be shy to share in the chat. And if you need to reference this later, we will have a recording as well. So Neil, are we good to go with the slides?
I believe so. Can you see the presentation, everyone?
Now we can see it. Yep.
Now we can see it. Okay, perfect.
Awesome. So this is this is me, and we'll jump right into the takeaways. Go right ahead, Neil.
Okay, perfect. All right. So for today's webinar, here are a couple of things that we'd like you to take away today. So one, really discussing why people trust people and what that kind of means for your inbox and campaign performance overall. I guess every time there's a change, it gets removed. How to bring your leadership and expert voices into your emails without actually adding a ton of work for your team. We'll also go through a couple of email formats you can use. So something we tend to see with a lot of the clients we work with is they're not quite sure where to start and what are some of these templates that you can use to just kickstart and make it easier for your team. How to structure and actually write your emails or your email strategy overall, ultimately with the end goal of building trust with your audience, not always focusing on the conversion. And then we'll take a quick look at, call it like a practical 14-day sprint that you can take, run with, try over the next 2 weeks, and hopefully see some positive signs on the other end. So getting started on this topic of, why people trust people and why this is important for most organizations. This is something that, when we're planning this webinar, Daniel and I were really quite passionate about this idea of how do you make the people within your organization a key part of your overall communication strategy, which kind of got us talking. And this is the topic we ended up on today. So I'll let Daniel kick things off and explain a bit more about why using your people in your campaigns is an important part of your overall strategy.
All right. So thank you so much, Nihal. Now, the most important thing to realize as we go into this is that people trust people more than they trust organizations. Obviously, the stats are there, right? People trust recommendations from individuals over companies. And the same is true with nonprofit organizations, charities, public sector as well. So what's human signal is actually what's missing from a lot of inboxes. We're going to dive into what that means today. And people are the new brands, right? More than ever. I noticed this transition over the past few years. I started off as a brand strategist, and I know that nowadays we're connecting a lot more deeply with individuals that we don't personally know. You may have heard of this concept of the parasocial relationships, where we have relationships with leaders, celebrities, potentially athletes, entertainers, government officials that they don't actually really have with us, because over time, they've built a presence, they've built a reputation. We've seen them in videos, newsletters, events, podcasts, right? So every touch point that you have ultimately helps you to build that connection. And right now, there's a stat that I saw recently. It's more in the e-commerce world, but 40% of people actually consult influencers before making a purchase. That's important to us, obviously, because it just emphasizes that people are trusting people over the institution sometimes, and they're more likely to resonate with them. All right. Now there was this really interesting opinion piece a while back from in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and they talked about how nonprofit CEOs can't afford to stay invisible. I don't know how many of you resonate with that idea of maybe you feel invisible right now, or your leader is, but that actual article sparked a whole wave of conversation across LinkedIn, and I saw a lot of really interesting takeaways there. But obviously today we're going to now apply that and help you to counteract that. So nonprofit leaders, we know you're expected to manage things like strategy, fundraising, governance, operations, a whole lot. And increasingly now that also looks like public visibility, thought leadership, and your online presence. And a lot of organizations that I work with, at least, they haven't necessarily operationalized that, and that creates what we call a visibility gap. Now, of course, email, as we'll go through today, is one of the ways that you can help to close that gap. So obviously we want to think about, for your organization, where does the visibility gap actually show up in the inbox, for example. There are thousands of nonprofit emails. I'm on a bunch of newsletters. I'm sure, Nihal, you're part of a bunch working with Cyberimpact. And sometimes it's just an update from the organization. The other day I saw an email come through my inbox where I didn't even remember how I got on that list. And the reason was that it was just signed off as the name of the organization. And I really wondered, like, who is this group? Who is this collective? Who's behind this? Do I know this person? Did I find them on LinkedIn? And it really, to me, that's a huge example of a visibility gap, where I almost unsubscribed because I didn't really feel like I had that connection with them. Even though the information in there was valuable, I wanted to know who it was coming from and who's behind it.
And I think that's a very important point when you consider that even your first touch point or interaction with that org was probably a person at that org, whether they're senior leadership or even just a volunteer. So being able to just bridge that gap by putting a trusted face out there, I think is pretty important, to your point.
And why that's important right now, you just mentioned trust, Neil. It's, Canadians are swimming in misinformation. Increasingly, there's all kinds of stats here about the increase of that. And so in an environment like that, it's not just about having great messaging, right? It's your job is to build trust. And so think about what your organization can control. And that's the signals that you're putting out there. That's the brand, that's the personal brand. And so we're going to obviously talk about how we can do that a little bit today. But yeah, these stats all just from last year. So fairly recent studies, people are losing trust. So when we talk about personal branding, some of you may or may not have, heard the term before. It's definitely come more and more into mainstream culture, but it hasn't been as much in the nonprofit and public sector. Now, I've seen a lot of nonprofit leaders who kind of resist this idea of personal branding. It's important to think that, in this case, we're not trying to tell you to become an influencer or, a vlogger or anything like that. What it is about is explaining your work, educating the public, advocating for issues. That's already part of your role, part of your job and your work day to day. Ultimately, thinking about using your personal brand to build that visibility. And I get all kinds of objections. I've heard it all working with founders and nonprofit leaders. Oh, it's not about me, it's about the mission, right? Well, we're here to say that basically personal branding amplifies that mission, right? By reaching more people and giving it an additional face. A lot of times people will say, I'm not comfortable on camera, right? Or I'm not a content creator. And my answer to you is to start with written content or simple voiceover videos. I spoke with an organization yesterday who had actually, they recorded a bunch of content, behind the scenes content, work in the field. And then they had a different team member who was more comfortable doing a voiceover and narrating that. So there are ways to show up regardless. And I just want to kind of try to address some of the common objections that I hear all the time.
And you might get into this a bit later, but I'm curious which of these tends to be the biggest one that you see, and what's kind of your strategy for handling those objections?
Yeah, I think the middle one there of, I'm not comfortable on camera. I think that is where there is an ability to start with a different type of content. Not every single person is made for video. But that doesn't mean that you can't still show up and have this presence and build this visibility through the strategy that we're talking about today. So that's definitely one. And then the last one there about, someone saying that, the executive director is way too busy for this. But there's definitely ways to streamline that. And, recording. I'm in my studio now. We have people come in for these 1-hour sessions. Even if you have half an hour a week or half an hour a month, we can find ways to be really strategic about the questions and topics that we're covering. So yeah, we can definitely get into more of that, but I got ways to help you address all of these. Right. So when we talk about your communications, obviously there's different voices, right? It's not all up to one person. So I like to break it down into these three categories. You've got the leader voice. That should share the big picture vision and perspective. There should be some opinions there, right? Then you've got the expert voice in your organization. That might look like a program manager or someone who's, doing research in the front lines, perhaps working with individuals that you serve. And then there's the organizational voice, which is, the overarching nonprofit brand. Often that's run by someone in communications or marketing, but that's the things like the campaigns that you do, the initiatives, the impact reports, and things like that, right? Now, I'm not at all suggesting one is better than the other. The goal, as a takeaway, is that when all three of these are active, your organization has different entry points into your work and into your organization, right? And we talked about platform. You can have all three of these no matter what the medium is. You can have all three of them through email. You can have all three of them through social content, through video. But it's important to think about these different voices because the strongest strategies will blend all three of them together.
Yeah, absolutely. And between these voices, is there often a voice that organizations tend to lean into more? And, when you maybe think they should be using more of the others?
I think, yeah, for years and years and years, we've mostly seen the organizational voice come through, right? And that's where you get these materials. You don't really know who's behind it, who's part of the team. They're very clear on their message. They're very clear on the brand and the ask oftentimes, but you don't really know, who's the expert here and who's the team here and who's the leader and why should I trust them, right? And that's where the other two, leader voice and expert voice, really start to come in.
Yep, a good point.
Awesome. So one of the examples that I wanted to shout out here, there's an organization called FoodShare in the Toronto area, and very simple. They reach out from a variety of different voices, right? They take turns through this one platform. So you'll see mail from their executive director, which is obviously one of the most common voices, right? But you'll also see comms from Orlando, who manages all of the farms and is a farmer himself. And you'll get messages from Andrea, who's the director of communications and development, for example, right? So they reach out from different people, whether it's through print or through email. In this case, they're sending out emails, and you'll see a handwritten thing there and a photo, right? So it's really building that personal connection, which ultimately builds trust. And that's especially important for people who are funding you on a ongoing basis, right? Because you want to build that trust over time. So that's a great example of that. And another example that I'll bring up here, if I can, y'all, is with Sava Food Bank. So they're based also in the general Toronto area, more so in Mississauga and the suburbs there. And they don't take as personal as approach. It's a slightly different approach here, but what they do is, they use great examples of storytelling here, and they're focusing on one thing at a time, right? Which I love. So, these emails are coming out here and it's focusing on a specific event or holiday or theme. and the whole email, the subject line is just about that. So sometimes it'll come from Sava, sometimes it'll come from an individual. So on the right, this is an email that I got recently from Manmeet, and the subject line really got me. It was $60 for a box of tomatoes. What should we do? Right? So that's an intriguing thing. I've never paid $60 for tomatoes. It sounds like an outrageous number. So what's going on here? And they're asking for my advice, right? And then, of course, in the email, it's very quickly explaining the problem just in 1 or 2 sentences with a graphic, and then they immediately go into how you can take action, right? Here's what we're looking for. So they just use that as a way to get us in. And I want to know what Manmeet is up to, who's able to go here and tell me from their first person perspective. Someone on the front lines is telling me this is what they need right now. There's some additional examples here from Sava. Again, and it doesn't always have to be negative. It doesn't always have to be about a big ask, right? So this one on the right, they're saying, 2 seniors visited our kitchen. This is what they said. That's pretty intriguing. It's a lot better than just saying, newsletter number 63 or, general Sava news. And it's saying at the right when you open that email, here to make you smile. Who isn't looking for more, positivity in their day-to-day, right? So in this case, they're being super brief, super personal here, but they're telling you what happened, a beautiful situation that happened in their kitchen last month with a photo. And even if you didn't get a photo, you can still tell the story, right? But it does help to have the photo. All right. And I do want to mention here, so I'm not sure how many of you on the call or, if you're watching this later, are working in marketing and communications roles versus a leadership role or another role in the organization, fundraising. But everyone has a role to play in this strategy, right? It's not just for marketers and communications teams. So I want to mention that, we can get into a weekly habit of this. I created something here called the proof loop that I use with clients, which is always thinking about your source, everyday meetings, conversations, FAQs, things you've had, feedback you've gotten. Then you want to capture that. So whether you're recording a voice memo, whether you're, taking notes into a shared document or something, there's a lot of source material in your day-to-day besides, just like coming into a studio and recording that I want to emphasize. So number 2, you're capturing that. Number 3, you're figuring out later how to shape that, right? So your communications team member, your social media manager, perhaps, they're going to use some type of tool or template to format that. Maybe there's some AI tools you can use, we can talk about, that help to ultimately take all that information, shape it down into digestible bits. Number 4 is to ship it. What does that look like? Is it going to be, a series of social posts? Is there an in-depth email you can write from that? Is there, things you can throw into your FAQ section on your website? And then finally, store that. And that's this concept of having a story bank so that you're never starting from scratch the next time you need to send out an email, right? You're not looking around the room thinking, okay, who can I talk to today? You have a story bank of material. So this is the concept. Again, we can't spend a ton of time on it here, but I just want to emphasize that most organizations already have the stories. You're just not capturing them. And this point, I've seen it personally, but this point continues to prove itself the more people I talk to that work in the sector.
And it's an interesting point around, I think, shipping, for example, where we see it even in orgs like us, where we'll sometimes get hung up on the, say, quality, or is this worth putting out? Or sometimes in organizations, there's layers of approval that folks might need to deal with. So what are some things when you're working with orgs that you try to get them to, say, reframe their thinking around when it comes to putting out content that's good enough rather than always aiming for perfection?
Absolutely. I think when you have a format, a series, right? Let's say it's a weekly email you're sending, or you have a daily Instagram story, or whatever it is. It could be a long form blog post. If you give yourself a series, you know how to kind of categorize things and you know what to expect for that. And you might start to think, okay, hey, this this comment that I just received on our Google reviews, or in a feedback form, that actually would be perfect for our weekly posts that we tend to do, featuring our clients or showing our impact, right? So you can kind of start to categorize it easily. And the second thing would be that you always have to think about who the audience is for those particular platforms. And with email, for example, with Sava, they clearly are doing making an effort to appeal to donors, to make sure that they always know that there's an ongoing need, but they're not making a kind of dramatic ask each and every time, right? So for them, when they ship something, they probably have a little checklist to understand, like, okay, what's the need this week? Do we need more tomatoes? Like, what's the specific need? Two, which programs are we trying to emphasize and bring more awareness to? Three, which team members have we not heard from or featured? So you can kind of create your own criteria to make it easier to decide, what to ship. And as long as it falls into those categories, it'll be easy to get into the flow of that. I really emphasize that, like, the more you get into the rhythm of these 5 steps, they'll just have stuff to be able to kind of paste in, and each post won't feel as heavy, right? As dramatic, the more that you're in that rhythm.
Absolutely. Thank you for that breakdown. All right.
Yes, and this is just to expand further on that idea of the story bank. So we can, we'll go through this super quick here, but the idea is that you want to build a story bank full of these different formats. And these are just different ways to build trust, right? And what's important is that if you are using AI tools, for example, whether it's AI tools or whether it's humans, they can all understand these kind of 5 repeatable story types that you can capture, again, from the work that's already happening, right? So we'll skip through these, but these are very common things that you can think about. All right, and then just a quick side note here. Again, we won't go into this in depth, but a lot of the questions I get are concerns about, what are we allowed to share? What permissions do we need? Super important. You want to always double check with your, your policies and making sure that privacy and things like that are being covered off. But I do want to make sure that doesn't completely stop you from sharing, right? So always look at consent, control, context, safety, and then the benefit at the end of the day for each piece of your content, whether it's an email, whether it's a video, whether it's a social post. This is just a quick thing that you can run through.
Awesome. And so, I did want to just, based off everything that Daniel just talked to us about, I was curious, for the folks that are on the presentations today, does anyone feel like they're doing this well, or have been trying to do something along these lines but getting stuck? Would be great to hear from you in the chat. Feel free to drop what you've been trying or what hasn't gone according to plan, and we can definitely get around to it a bit later as well.
Yeah, we'd love to see, if it's whether it's, if you're doing a good job, or if you've tried to capture stories, through any of the parts of the process I talked about, or is there an organization that you've seen that is doing it super well? We'd be happy to, take a look at that after. You can drop it in the chat to share. We're always looking to hear what you're up to as well.
Absolutely. You can do it in the chat, or there's also a dedicated Q&A section if you want to use that as well. So please don't be shy. Feel free to ask as many questions as you would like. Awesome.
Yeah. I think just a side note there, I think it's really important that we learn from each other, right? There's a lot of best practices and guides and strategies, but nothing is better than actually seeing that being applied, right? And how we're all using it together.
100%. Which I guess is a nice little segue into just expanding on a lot of the stuff that Daniel talked to us about, right? Really making the case for using your people and the people in your organization to actually build trust, not just using logos or the activities that your org is doing. Because at the end of the day, your email is a very owned, very consent-filled channel that people want to be there at the end of the day, right? So for the rest of the session, we're going to take a look at how this could play out in your email program, and tackle a couple of things that you could maybe try to change or try working on this week or next week, I suppose, because this is a short week for some of us. But ultimately, we're going to just walk through sender voices that actually earn the open from your audience, a couple of email formats that you can glean from some of the content you're already creating, as well as a sample 14-day sprint and experiment that you could run with your team, if you feel like it. So before we actually dive into some of the tactics, this is something that we try to talk about a lot at Cyberimpact, regardless of what industry you're working in, right? Where email ultimately is one of the highest trust channels you own. And for many nonprofits, it's actually one of the highest trust channels that you own. And I think it often is, the value of email is negated in a lot of organizations because it's just always there, right? Like email is something that every year you hear, is this the year email is over? And the answer is always no. But you do see that, folks will start investing a lot in organic, or they'll invest in paid ads. They'll really put a heavy focus on getting new people through the door. But something that I think we really need to start thinking about more is this concept of your own audience, right? And I think it's something, Daniel, you've really been a big proponent of, building your brand, owning your audience. And social is definitely a key part of that. But the average organic reach on socials, I think, don't have the stat here, but it's around 6% of your followers. And it really depends on how the algorithm is feeling that day, right? So even if you have 10,000 followers, maybe you're hitting, 5 to 10% of them on a good day. And you ultimately don't actually get to pick who you're targeting with that content you're putting out. On the flip side, you have email, where email is in many ways the opposite. The people that opted into your list are engaged with your brand, with your organization at some point. In Canada especially, we have double opt-ins. So it's very heavy on the consent, where your subscribers are truly choosing to be there, be on your list. And Canada is interesting in that, Castle, as well as like Law 25 in Quebec, we put a lot of emphasis on privacy and compliance, right? And a lot of orgs that we end up talking to often view this as a blocker or something annoying to deal with. But I actually view it as more of a really solid filter, right? Because with these stricter opt-in and consent laws, the people that actually choose to be there are there for a reason, right? And we see this in some of the stats that we'll walk through later, where nonprofit engagement through email is actually one of the highest across industries in Canada. So building on this, I think something that's really interesting to think about is that retention is really the core part of any organization's, call it donor or growth strategy, where it's a lot easier, if you do it right, to retain a customer once you actually, retain a donor once you actually get them through the door. And the big part here is actually that acquisition costs have gone up significantly in the past couple of years. So in the past 5 years, acquisition costs have gone up pretty much 3x across industries. And I don't really see that slowing down anytime soon, right? And the nice thing about email is it does let you build attention and interest from your audience in a cumulative fashion. And this is like a really strong example that Daniel was kind enough to provide, where, when it comes to FoodShare's monthly email donor program, about 96%, they have about 96% monthly donor retention. And a large part of this is driven through the way they've built their email program. While 49% are like a one-time gift retention, right? And basically when they were doing one-time sends, usually just focusing on the ask, they essentially end up with one-time donors most of the time. Once they actually shifted their strategy, they're seeing much more stickiness with those monthly donors. Give me a second. And, I think this is one of the interesting questions that you can kind of ask yourself. And maybe when you're framing email as a channel, we historically used to think of email as this broadcast channel, right? It's, I have something to say, I'm just going to go say it. But at the end of the day, we forget that there's a person on the other side, right? And you're also a person sending the email. So why not think about what happens when we change from to become a person? And this is just based on some research we were doing when preparing for this presentation. So, might be take this with a grain of salt. But essentially, when it comes to the sender type and the impact on your open rates and conversion, most of the time when orgs send, they're sending it just from the organization. So I would kind of view that as your baseline that sets the tone for your email performance. And I think this also provides like a nice testing roadmap for you, where you could even just go through each of these sender types and see how your audience actually responds to the emails sent from these different people. So I won't necessarily run through each of these numbers. You'll have them in the slide. But what is essentially interesting across the board is when you get staff members involved, you know, as the primary sender, your founder, as well as a mix, you're often going to see a much larger increase impact on your open rate, because people just recognize you and the people in your org much more frequently, right? And the whole point with email is to stay top of mind. Cool. Let me see how this works. So we do have a quick poll, and it would be great if everyone was able to answer if they feel comfortable. But we are curious right now, what's the biggest blocker to your ED or your leader or other experts in your org when it comes to being more visible in email? And I believe there's a poll that should just popped up and should take you just like 10 seconds to answer.
Yeah, you just, if you don't see it, click on interactions there, and you should be able to see the poll.
Awesome. I'll give folks like 10 seconds, and then I'll read the responses. It's always interesting watching it change in real time. I feel like there's a couple of folks that also switched their answers, which I think is interesting. So don't worry, I don't think your leaders here are seeing these results. So unless you're the leader, in which case. All right, I'll give 5 more seconds, and then I'll end this poll. All right, last call. Awesome. Cool. So let me know if everyone can see the results in the interactions panel. But it is interesting that time and the approval process seems to be the biggest blockers, rather than, you know, comfort or not knowing where to start. And I think you spoke to this quite well in your section as well, Daniel, where if you can make the approval process simple by building a system, and you just make the time commitment very lean, I think it's a lot easier to get buy-in when you don't turn it into a massive additional project. Okay. Awesome. Thank you all for your answers. And, you know, one more question for you, if anyone is comfortable answering. You know, we're kind of curious about when you're working in your organization. Is this the question? I guess this could be for anyone here. It could be for you, Daniel. But, you know, when it comes to like nonprofit email programs, I'm sure as you're doing research, you kind of understand that different nonprofits probably have stronger programs. Others might not have a very complex or just kicking off the program right now. Curious, what are some of the visibility gaps that you notice when it comes to the inbox and showing up in front of your audience? Daniel, you'd mentioned something around you received an email the other day and you weren't quite sure who it was from, right? I'm curious if there's other examples like that that you see often and have tips on how we can avoid doing that in our programs.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see if there's any other examples. But one of the unfortunate ones is where there's like an incredibly value-packed email. It's full of some great information, maybe some compelling stats, maybe a report, but the subject line is like, you know, May 20th email newsletter or, you know, or something generic, right? Like, you know, save the children update, like just that, right? And I think that does impact visibility. And nowadays we are, as you know, Nihal mentioned as well, we're competing for attention. So it's that combination of, you know, who the email's coming from, and also what is that subject line that prevents people from even getting to epic Yeah, the epic content that you spent so much time and effort putting together, right? So that's one of the things that I see quite often, and it's still common, despite the efforts people are putting into their email program.
Absolutely. And I think it's a nice reminder that when you start thinking about the person on the other side, it's like, I've gone in and put all this effort into writing this really solid piece of content, but I still need to think about the hook and like, what am I actually trying to get
Yeah.
across immediately, right? Because to your point, people have a short attention span, and you do need to try to stand out in the inbox a little bit, which I think is a really nice way to build on what you talked about earlier with the story types and the formats that organizations can potentially use, right? And these are, of course, just a couple of them. But the idea is to think about some of those story types Daniel had mentioned earlier and how those could actually relate to, call it like a subject line or an email for your organization. So, for example, if it was coming from your leader, it could be a subject line like what I'm seeing this season, very personal, very high level. And it kind of gives an overview of like, here's how our organization's working and what we're kind of working on. When it comes from your staff or people on the front line, I think this is a great time to objection handle. So this is a way you can actually use the people that, the folks that donate to you or maybe use the services of your organization. Giving them a face to actually answer the questions is really key. I think another place that leaders can really make a difference and should show up is when anything changes within either the mission, vision, messaging, branding, whatever it is, because you are ultimately the call it the key holder of everything that this organization is doing, right?
And
Yeah.
I'll add to that as well. It's not only if something within the organization changed, but also one of the things that I'm commonly seeing as a great opportunity for organizations to step up and leaders to step up is, changes in government programs, in funding announcements, in changes to policy, and how that impacts your organization. So I definitely saw, there was a few organizations that took the opportunity to really get involved and kind of own the narrative. Over the last couple months, there were some announcements and some changes, and they were saying that they're excited to see how that impacts specifically their sector, their niche that they're in. So that really is a great example of using it as a touch point to educate and inform your audience, right? And keeping them up to date without, again, there's no ask, right? You are capturing people who want to know, what did I just miss? Like, what was this news? What was this change, right?
And it's an interesting part of the nurture strategy where, to nurture your audience, you do need to provide value before you actually make any asks. And if you can become a source of authority or like a voice that they can rely on to keep them updated, you're going to become like a source of news, right? Maybe not the only source, but all you really want to be is, find that hardcore group of followers, supporters, whatever it might be, that actually resonate the most with your message. Something that I thought would be interesting to just quickly walk through, right, is how do you potentially shift from a generic org voice into more of a leader voice story? And so this is like an example I think we often see across different programs. And in this case, for example, the from is from an info email. Personally, I really dislike info emails. I think it's like, where's the person, right? Like info feels like a very general email meant for everything. Instead, even if it was just like, support at your org or like fundraising, whatever it is. But ultimately, I think it's best for it to actually come from a person. And a lot of like email softwares, regardless of what you're using, will let you set and adjust this for every email you send. On the left, you see that it's a generic subject line, enhancing program X, sign up today. But there's no real compelling reason for someone to click into it. And the body is often fairly generic, just straight up announcement. Afterwards, it's how this could change is actually to have it come from someone, let's say Sarah, who's your ED, talking from a first person perspective, right? Here's what we're hearing and here's what actually helps. And what it kind of does is it gives you this structure of the email where you can objection handle, walk people through what they can actually expect, let's say, from this new program, give them proof of like this program working for other cohorts. I think safety, consent, security, all those pieces Daniel mentioned earlier as well are very important, especially within the fundraising space where, you know, people are ultimately, in many cases, putting their wallet on the line and to support your cause. So making sure that they feel comfortable trusting your organization is pretty key. Awesome. We'll quickly run through these, but, you know, I think generally when it comes to your subject lines and what Daniel was mentioning earlier, really try to keep them human. You know, and I know that's a little cheesy and maybe a little overused in when it comes to talking about marketing and the way we speak, but really do try to make it seem like it's coming from a person, not just a organization. So this could be things like first person openers, you know, using I statements in your subject line. You can ask questions. I think the like that Sava example was excellent, right? Like $60 for a box of tomatoes. What should we do, right? Something like that. Because now you're like, what should we do? And you really want to know more. Specific. I think this is something that, because we're trying to reach as many people as possible, we'll sometimes default to broadness. But I think, like with any writing or any communication, imagine you're just speaking to one person on the other side, right? And making sure that it resonates with them. And did you have something to add on there, Daniel?
Nope, absolutely. It's just, we're just emphasizing that example that I mentioned with like that organization that's just sharing their monthly update, right? There's no incentive to really open that or information about what's in there. And people nowadays, they they want to know what they're getting into before they get into it.
Click it, 100%. Yeah. Awesome. And then just to quickly run through this, you know, it's also important for you to think about matching the right voice to the right audience. These are just examples. It could differ based on the actual org and how you operate. But think about who's most likely to be interacting or engaging with your audience on the other side, and do your best to actually match that voice to the audience, either within your campaigns or even when you do segmentation. And I think this is a really great way for you to actually make sure that your content's resonating really well with the audience on the other side. And Daniel, you know, we're trying to figure out what's a good example to actually showcase this, and you came up with a great one that I would love for you to walk through.
Yes, absolutely. So this is one of the ones that was actually featured recently at a conference, and as we mentioned, you know, often people just kind of blast an email to their whole list, but there is a lot of power here in segmentation. And Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, now they have many chapters, so this is from one of their chapters that did this, but they specifically have this this walk that they do, Take Steps. So a specific campaign. But because they were kind of just blasting the same thing to everyone, they saw really, really impacted their open rates. And so in this case, we know that, you know, the average person has a very low attention span, and they can't be sending these long paragraphs anymore. This is kind of what they were realizing as an organization. So what they did was they decided to specifically reduce the email volume and started segmenting their messages by audience type. And I think that's really important because, you know, similar to a relationship in person, you know, I'm not going to, you know, meet Nihal for coffee and automatically ask him to, you know, hand him an invoice and say, hey, I think we should work together. Like, you should hire me, right? You're going to build a relationship over time and maybe try some things and discuss, learn more about each other and figure out which areas Nihal's most interested in, you know, and you're not going to make that ask on the first, in the first meeting. And so similarly, depending on where people are involved, sometimes you have a volunteer with the organization. You don't want to be sending them the same ask as, you know, one of your past supporters that's been supporting for 5 years with monetary donations. You could actually offend people and turn them off from continuing to support if you're not sometimes personalizing or at least segmenting people correctly, right? So just some examples here. They did share, you know, very specifically what they did as an organization. And they changed it to, again, targeting people from the spot that they're on. Yeah, you can go to the next slide to show that. And so part of that, you know, part of the takeaway here is that, again, a strong email strategy comes from sending fewer, clearer, and more relevant messages to actually make supporters know what action you want them to take. And that's obviously, their results showed that this dramatically worked for them. They even talked about, reducing, for example, the amount of text with some of those audiences and embedding a YouTube video or linking to a YouTube video. And what they've seen is that people are more likely to click the call to action button if there's less information or less content in that particular campaign. They increased their visuals. Sometimes they even embedded GIFs, for example. Before that, they were sending people out to read more information elsewhere, but they realized those people weren't all coming back to the email, right? To take the action that they actually wanted them to take. So streamlining this really helped. And as you can see by the quote on that slide there, it says that our email rate has climbed, our click rate has climbed, and our unsubscribe rate has dropped. That is also an important sign. People want to stick around and provide that value. So again, summary, you got to know who you are speaking to in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the nice thing about it is that you can actually automate a lot of these personalized interactions with your audience, and you should, right? Like, we're not really going to go deep into it here, but something that we often do when we speak to the nonprofits that we work with is really thinking about segmentation and building the system for your organization, right? I think it reduces the ongoing work for your team because it gives you this always on engagement engine with your audience. It lets you scale your personalization while still actually keeping that, say, human touch. And, we can definitely go deeper into these like another time, but these are just some examples of like how you could potentially roll some of your leader voices or org voices into different types of sequences.
And just a side note there, we did have a poll. Most of you answered already for the leader versus organization in terms of who's sending those emails, but also a new poll just about segmentation, which a few of you have already answered here about, do you currently have separation and segments in your audiences as well? So just wanted to shout that out in case you haven't answered. Thank you.
Awesome. Great to see that most folks here seem to be segmenting. So love to see it. Okay, very quick. When it comes to measurement, this is always something that is changing every year. And, it really has a ton of factors into it. One of the biggest changes in recent times is just how AI is entering the inbox and filtering out content, right? And what are some of those signals that they're looking at? I'd say these are like the 3 or 4 that tend to send trust signals, because what's interesting about AI filters is they're no longer just looking for keywords or specific flags. They're actually taking the full email context into account, as well as what your actual reputation and content history and engagement history is over time. So how is your audience actually engaging with your emails over time, not just at an individual email level? So where this often shows up, attention metrics, things like open rates, your list growth, and as Daniel mentioned, keeping that unsubscribe rate low is often a sign that even if people aren't necessarily opening or engaging in a traditional sense with your email, the fact that they're not unsubscribing means that they're probably opening your email, reading it. Even if they're not taking action, it still feeds into building that trust and connection with them, right? So we often encourage folks to think about how to actually build up to an ask instead of just thinking about the ask throughout the entire campaign. So that could look like education, social proof ask. It could be a mix, but ultimately don't worry so much about conversion metrics. I would really focus on attention and trust metrics, especially for the types of folks that are here today. Something that I did want to call out, and I think this is good news for the NPO space in Canada specifically. We recently did just launch our State of Email Marketing in Canada report. Honestly, first of its kind. Most folks are looking at US and UK data. We were like, let's do the Canadian version. So what's really nice to see is across industries, nonprofits actually outperform almost every industry out there. And you can see these numbers where the Canadian averages are on the left and nonprofit performance is on the right. And what the 2 things that I think are really interesting, one, the click-through rate, so people actually taking action, is very high, which is great to see. The unsubscribe rate is pretty much half of the other industries. Once again, really strong signal that email is a trusted channel for a lot of nonprofits. And at its core, I think the statement at the bottom is really what it's about. It's that nonprofits have this innate level of permission, trust, and meaning as to why they're getting in touch, right? Compared to, say, a business that's just trying to sell you something. And just building on everything we've said, right? Putting your leader's voice behind this channel is kind of how you actually turn an above average list, let's call it, into an unforgettable one. So an audience that knows the people in your org, which ultimately builds a stronger connection with your organization as well. Okay, really quick. This is something that you can try out with your team, and you'll have this in the slide, but think of it as an email voice sprint, right? So make a couple of easy fixes to what you're doing right now with your emails, run a quick audit, do 1 or 2 drafts from new voices on your team, and then test it out, right? And see how it performs. And, I think if there are a couple of things, there's a lot of good stuff that we covered today, but 3 things that we would like you to take away today. 1, brand is a true trust signal, as Daniel mentioned, and people that decide that you're credible enough to support, share, or follow, they make that decision well before you actually ask them for anything, right? And I think it's important to always keep that in mind. You're building a relationship, not just selling or sharing something. Definitely try to add more voices into your overall strategy. Like Daniel mentioned, it's a team effort. It doesn't just fall in marketing, doesn't just fall in comms, and doesn't just fall in your leaders. You can actually loop the entire org into this motion. And I think the proof is a really big piece, where sometimes we're afraid to maybe show some of the behind the scenes or even the bad side of the work that you end up doing. But this is often a really strong way to actually get buy-in from your audience.
And we already know that you're already doing that good work, right? It's a matter of showcasing that and getting into, as we talked about, the proof loop, the signals, the things that you need to remind yourself to capture that, remind your team to capture that, is probably the most important thing to make this impactful.
Awesome. And that's it for our presentation today. Thank you so much for the wonderful content, Daniel. I think this has been a great conversation. Would love to know if anyone has any questions. You can drop them once again in the Q&A chat, or we can even bring you on stage if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, if there's any specific questions, doesn't have to be just about the exact content we covered. Mm-hmm. We have 4 minutes to answer questions.
Right. I'll read this. I'll read this for you. Sorry. So thank you, Christian. So in our organization, we have seen both sides. Having a recognizable person in announcements created more engagement, but we also experienced risks when an employee became too closely associated with the org's image and later created legal and reputational issues. Interesting. So how would you recommend balancing human presence with institutional brand protection?
That's an awesome question. I think this is one of the reasons why organizations are hesitant to kind of make one person the face, and that's why, if you kind of think back to that slide there where I had those 3 different columns of who the voice belongs to, and first and foremost, it's brand, right? I do workshops on taking a brand first approach to everything that you do. And so people should have that understanding and that relationship with the brand as an organizational brand first. But beyond that, the people that are part of it will have their own variation of that, right? Their own flavor, so to speak, but on the same dish. And so your leader voice, the expert voice, the organizational voice, you want to definitely balance that out, where absolutely, you can't argue that if the executive director is the go-to person, if they're the one always, in the media, if they're the one always showing up in the newsletters, always from them, if there's a challenge there because they leave, or there were some kind of legal or reputational issues, as you mentioned, then you're kind of out of options and you have this kind of silent period. You don't really know what to do. So this is why it is so important to have the expert voice in there, the program staff, the researchers, the people who are working day to day in the front lines. Perhaps it's someone else from your marketing and comms team, depending on how large your team is. that kind of spreads it out. I've worked with organizations who do that already voluntarily because the executive director, doesn't want to take all the credit, or maybe they're more of the academic and research driver behind the organization. But in many cases, it should not default exclusively to the executive director. It needs to also be people on the board members who are typically democratically elected and voted on and have term limits, right? So the board can kind of handle some of those larger inquiries, as well as the staff and the director. Failing all of that, you can also let the people that you're serving, depending on the type of organization you run, have a voice and speak on your behalf as well. With Sava Food Bank, we had some incredible stories that we captured during a video shoot where we thought the staff would have the most to say, but really one of their team members or volunteers who had actually started herself as a customer of the food bank, went through some programs, actually got a role volunteering with the organization, and then a job. She was probably the best spokesperson out of our series there, right? So there are people who can step in. But I do want to acknowledge, of course, that there can be, to your point, you want to make sure that there's no legal or ethical issues there, but switch it up and definitely vary it up as well.
Awesome. Well, we are at time, but thank you for that great question, Christian, and thank you for the awesome answer, Daniel, and thank you everyone for attending today. This was a great content, Daniel. Really appreciated you taking the time to talk through this with us. And we do have one more, but I'll quickly just let you know that if anyone here is curious in either tackling this branding for your organization, or just want a second pair of eyes on your email strategy, you have both options here. You have myself, you have Daniel. You can reach out to us anytime. We'll send a couple of resources and links your way after this, along with the link to the recording. So if you did want to pass this along to either your teammates or anyone else in your organization, please feel free to do that. I did want to shout out that Daniel will be throwing a first of its kind Impact Summit. Is it in November? Yeah, in November 5th in Toronto.
November 5th.
Yeah. So if you were interested in attending, I think it's going to be a wonderful day with a lot of great nonprofit leaders and folks working in the space. And if you are interested in attending, you do have this partner code to get 10% off your ticket. So please do use it. Please come. We'd love to see you there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just put the link there in the chat. To answer Grace's question, I think it's a great question. Obviously, I think it's important to look at. Did you want to read it out first, Nihal, real quick?
Yes, I'll read it out. So, we are currently operating in an increasingly competitive funding landscape where donors and partners receive large volumes of NGO emails daily, often leading to email fatigue. Beyond the strategies already mentioned, what are the most effective ways for NGOs to genuinely capture attention and increase the likelihood that recipients will open, read, and engage with their emails, despite the high volume of comms they receive?
Yeah, certainly, Grace. I hope that some of the tactics that Nihal kind of went through towards the second half of the presentation there, can be helpful for that in terms of the open rates. I also think that it's you want to take kind of a holistic approach, and I often talk about creating this visibility ecosystem, right? Of you're going to be wanting to reach people in a few different places, right? I'm not saying that stop email or do more email, but it really is about where else are they seeing you. The average person, as you know, they see a lot of information, hundreds and hundreds of messages per day, through social, through ads, through communications with their friends. So relevance is what matters more than volume. I think that's really important. But also that engagement starts before that email, before the subject line, right? Where else are they seeing you? Are they are they following you on social media? Are they connected with any of your staff or leaders on LinkedIn? Can you find them and connect with them on LinkedIn? Are they connected with any of your collaborators or partner organizations? What are some other ways where you can reach them? And on top of that, playing the game of, Nihal mentioned the percentage of the fall that actually see your content sometimes it can be low. So what are those multiple angles where they're getting that message from, right? The executive director, staff member here, sponsor, supporter. How are you able to do that? Some could absolutely be paid. Paid ads certainly work. I focus mostly on organic, but it can definitely be important sometimes to reach out directly through paid. And every once in a while, you might want to send something personal to them, right? Choose a couple of people from your audience and directly try to reach out to them and engage with them. Like, make it literally, take someone from your list, start a new email thread from your Outlook or your Gmail. Say, hey, just checking in. Actually, notice that you either haven't been opening our emails or you've been a supporter for a long time. Just want to reach out and chat with you or ask you a couple of questions. What can we do for you? How can we help? Like, super brief, and really taking that relationship to the next level. Sometimes you can be surprised. One personal interaction with someone could have them buy in for another year, right? So hopefully that answered your question, Grace. I know that we are definitely competing constantly for attention. You can definitely use all types of other tools and automations, but sometimes nothing beats that personal reach out if you can.
And if I were to just quickly finish this out, and I know we're over, so thank you for the folks that have stuck around. But I think when it comes to like email fatigue, this is something we also hear a lot from a lot of the NGOs that we work with, where, oh, people are unsubscribing from my list, or, oh, like my list, size has decreased significantly. And it's sometimes easy to view that as a negative. How I like to think about it is, over time, people naturally have channels that they resonate with, right? For some of your donors, it might be email. For some of your other donors, it's text. Some it's social, whatever it is. Some it's in person. So really getting people, and people will ultimately self-sort into the channels that work best for them. So instead of maybe thinking about the folks that are getting fatigued by emails, of course, if it's a really big problem, definitely audit and see where that gap is. But if it's, let's say, a small segment, I would go the route that Daniel mentioned, right? Like, take that small segment, figure out what are the blockers to getting them to engage more. And really, at the end of the day, something we forget to do a lot is you can just ask, right? I think there's a person on the other side. You can ask them what they want, what they like, and how you can actually create more relevance for them so they do want to stick around. So tons of strategies, and that's a great idea for us to maybe think about putting together a little guide or playbook on how you could approach this. So thank you for that idea, Grace.
Absolutely. All right. Well, feel free to connect with us. As you can see on the screen here, I did put the link in the chat for the summit, but I'm more than happy to connect with you on LinkedIn if you have any further questions. Neil, I'll turn it over to you to wrap things up.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again, Daniel. This has been an excellent and very informative presentation, and thank you everyone for taking the time and staying over. We will be running a couple more webinars throughout the summer. I know folks will be away on vacation, but we'd love to see any of you that are interested on our upcoming webinars. We'll send over some of those links, as I mentioned, along with the recording. And yeah, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. We're both quite friendly. If you're in Toronto, we'd also love to grab coffee or like chat in person as well. So yeah, thank you again for being here. And there is a hidden team member who is off stage, Daniel 2.0. So thank you for helping us with this webinar.